Now. Okay, thanks for joining me, Michael Tsarion. You've joined me today to talk about shadow work, in particular the very difficult subject of the Anima and Animus integration, which I think is probably one of the hardest subjects in relation to shadow work. And I've got this little quote here: integration of the shadow or realization of the personal unconscious marks the first stage of the analytic process, and without it, a recognition of anima or animus is impossible. So how are you, Michael?
Good, love. Thanks very much for the invitation. It's always a pleasure. Great questions as well from the members.
So can you tell me what is your take on the anima animus? I've been putting on quite a few quotes today about it, all by Jung. I just wonder how you would describe it yourself in your own words.
Well, remember, the whole thing is based on his concept of archetypes, Jungian archetypes. And these are forces that really represent the fundamentals of what we call consciousness. And if this is all new to somebody, just think of how you become a thinking being. Even though our institutions don't cover it, psychology is really all about that. It's about the fundamentals of how we become different than animals, how we have these transcendent qualities of thought, of self-reflection, and so on. So he had a whole bunch of what he called archetypes. I also refer to them as antetypes. Ante meaning before, A-N-T-E type. And that's why I call them that, because it highlights the fact that that the past is very important when it comes to the concept of archetypes. Because they're an inheritance of past experiences, right? There's nothing really supernatural about it. They're all from our forefathers, our forebears' experiences of just the world and of reality. And they accrue over a long, long period of time and become the structures of thought. This is what Jung's primary interest was. He took originally what Freud had toyed with, and didn't get that far with. But Freud did set down a platform in which, Jung and Otto Rank and others could spring for. So there's no negating Freud's relevance in any of this by any means. It's just that he was incapable, being more of an atheist. He just was very, concerned about mechanistic, sort of animalistic, aspects of consciousness. And Jung saw that that wasn't wholly correct. Elements were correct, but other parts were not. So the archetypes are really a big study, and as you know, it takes a lifetime, because it's really not just about a study of them in a sort of intellectual way. It's about coming upon them yourself. And that makes all the difference in the world. There's a lot of people who read books of Jung. Jung's books have sold many. There's a lot of different readers and so on. But that doesn't mean that any of those people are actually undertaking any of the things that he talked about on a legitimate psychological level, you see. So for most of the world, it's just a bunch of intellectual writings and thoughts, but very, very few people undertake anything in the form of praxis, what he was speaking about.
It's very hard, isn't it, to try and identify these sort of archetypes within ourselves. I think, first of all, to find them outside of ourselves, but then to actually identify them in ourselves, and especially the anima and animus. I know that for the anima, a man will see it kind of in the woman. He'll project his anima onto a woman, so he'll project it onto maybe a beautiful woman, maybe a siren, someone who's very sort of like muse-like in that kind of sexual way. And I think women kind of internalize it more. It's kind of maybe harder. I don't know, maybe harder for women to identify. What do you think of that?
About the projection?
About the ability to grasp what it is, to grasp what the anima and animus is.
Oh yeah, when it comes to the archetypes and their actual presence, influence, function, whatever you want to call it, it's nigh on impossible. Remember, we are living in an actual anti-psychological, you and I have talked about this before. I have some very radical ideas that definitely are based in Jung, but could not be directly attributed to Jung. I think they can, but that's a big argument, you'd have to have with somebody. But basically, I think if he was alive, he'd agree that we're, and many of his writings also show that we have a deep inhibition to facing ourselves as selves. And this is the ultimate answer to questions like that. And that is, it's already difficult to start with, to even, be aware of it, to get behind it and observe, that these archetypes are operating in your life, especially like you say, in, say, human relationships. And by the way, if we talk about Anima, you know, more as we go. It's crucial to the whole dynamics of relationships, but it's already hard enough for any individual to see, you know, the influence of archetypes, let alone in an anti-psychological world. So another thing about Jung, Freud, all of these people is that they really largely fallen by the wayside. Jung has been very much misinterpreted. We're going to have guests on Enslaved that, you know, I've seen doing some Jungian work with people who claim to have 40 years of experience as Jungian experts or whatever, you know, and there's a whole thing we're going to get into, you know, to really show that that's how spurious that really is. You know what I mean? I mean, the amateur can learn more accurate stuff, as I've done. I'm not a trained psychologist, but I am an expert in the subject from just continual study, and also looking at all the different, you know, mistakes and errors and the misinterpretations, either directed by total political correctness or some other nonsense. Because you see, he who comes to psychology has a psychology, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So you know, and they may come to it, oh, it's just another subject, you know, I took a course and I'm going to get a PhD in it and all the rest of it, you know, just like you would do in electric engineering or something like that. That's a very different kind of being who's in it for, you know, legitimate existential reasons, because it's all about confrontation then. It's all about self-confrontation, self-awareness. One of the questioners that you sent said, you know, what are the steps there? And that's what we're talking about right now. And how much does it have to do with self-awareness? It has everything to do with it, you know, and then from that point comes all the other battery of subjects, interests, opinions, and, you know, all your worldly interactions. Self-knowledge is what Jung died, you know, writing about, trying to say that this is the absolute prime datum.
Mm-hmm. So how do we actually start to have practical tips on how to identify the anima and animus within us?
Well, exactly. Yeah, it's a long process because it involves, it's very little to do with intellect. You know, just going by what we said a few seconds ago. We'll touch on other things in a minute, but just sticking with that theme is that you will not be able to encounter, right, any archetypal activity until you've awakened feeling, and until you've awakened deep feeling. Yeah. You know, and this is a kind of special kind of feeling. Because it's a special kind of a, you know, thing that you're really talking about. And when it comes to the anima, even more so, right? See, people normally speak of that you'll encounter it, you know, or even if you do encounter it, they're claiming that the anima itself comes into being, you know, because it's infused with womanhood, right? And motherliness and motherhood, right? And all of that's very true. But there's something that we've experienced as the race before we've actually experienced motherhood, you know, and this is often left out. So people start too late. They're already starting with a man's experience of woman, woman's experience of woman. And then that accumulation of experience will become what we know as the anima. But doesn't nature precede all of that? Right? You know, and I'm not saying it is. I'm saying, you know, one has to look at it, right? Even the tribes, they never found a square tribal layout. It's always circular. So there's already something of a natural, you know, sort of backstory. And that's where I would start it, that that the experience of the anima is nature, what's known in German psychology, you know, in existential psychology, the Umwelt, right? Umwelt means all around world. Now this is experienced by a fetus in the womb, for instance, right? That would be its natural environment, is the womb, and so on. So we are animalistic. You know, that's why Dionysus as a god was a god, because Dionysus preserved the remembrance, and again, not necessarily saying conscious remembrance, that we are animalistic, that are the roots of the earth and the soil of the earth is our origin. And so most of the early goddesses, who is it? Astarte was called, you know, the lady of the two horns, just like Dionysus with the horns, right? So the horned animal, you know, the stag, the deer, you know, your gods like Pan and Priapus, all of that meant earth. Chthonic, it's called. A very strange word, chthonic. And the chthonic roots come first. So that what we know of an anima doesn't just go back to simple motherhood, as most people would think. It goes back to the Umwelt, which is nature. And when it comes to early man's experience of nature, intellect was very down on the scale of relationship. It was awe, it was astonishment, right? And all of that. So our absolute connection with nature is primordial when it comes to the anima, and the awakening of the kind of Emersonian feeling, which is quite deep. you know, that's essential.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think anyone who comes to shadow work, they can't do anything unless they have that connection with nature again. And then, because that is also the connection with the self, isn't it? It's the connection with the body and how the body feels and where you've stored your emotions and how you kind of, you've kind of tied them up in your body. You can only really get to that once you can start to go outside in nature and start to experience the outside world, which I think a lot of us, especially in cities, we miss that so much, especially when we're brought up in cities.
The city is an obscenity. The city is the way that is actually kind of deliberate, because then we have, with the Umwelt, we've got Mitwelt, which is society. And they're meant to be in harmony. But actually Mitwelt, more and more from its inception, has been the thing that blocks our connection to nature. So there's a bit of a willfulness involved as well, you know.
Oh, right, okay. Okay, so how can we work with the anima? How do we begin to think about integrating it? So we talked about nature, about kind of, but how can we start to recognize the archetype within us? This is a really difficult concept for lots of people who are doing their shadow work. They get to the first bit, they understand that, you know, that there is an unconscious, that they've been kind of hiding things away in their shadow. But then the next step is confrontation with the anima or animus. So how do they start to recognize it within themselves?
Well, won't be able to without awakening this level of emotion. Maybe emotion is not even the right word. It's more a kind of empathy, right? It's more a kind of empathy with the self. When we talk about empathy, we normally talk about other people. 9 times out of 10, every time that word is used, in fact, most of the time, even emotion or feeling is used, right? It's about relationships with other people. And this is absolutely false, right? Original empathy, original feeling. Now, I use the word centroversion, you know, just to distinguish it from normal feeling. You know, because you can feel towards a dog or a cat or whatever, you know, it's not in the same league as that at all. We think it is. And that's part of this Mitwelt training, the training of society and all that, and peers, right? But as a matter of fact, the deep empathy, which I call centroversion, is the door that, or at least it's the key that unlocks the door. You still have a choice to, you know, back off and go back into the worldly fiasco, or you can proceed slowly. And you're right, we should talk about shadow, because remember, before you meet the anima and animus, you meet the shadow. So maybe we have a few words about that in a minute. But the idea is, well, even with the shadow though, what I'm saying now goes for any archetypal encounter. It cannot and will not happen without centroversion, which again in brackets is a deep empathic relationship with oneself. You think that we'd all know this, right? No, it's never taught. In fact, you're rewarded in life right from the moment that you're born. First of all, you're reaching out to others to survive. That's considered survival and necessity. And you have a level of empathy in order to get that survival. This is not what we're talking about, right? This is a mystical or quasi-mystical concept now, which has got its roots in existential psychology and existential philosophy. And people can make of that what they want. But the fact is, without awakening the deep feeling, the centroversion, and the empathy toward the self, the archetype's just passing through. It's like you might as well open a motel. You know, they're not sticking around, and you won't have any legitimate, you know, connection with them at all.
I'd also say that at the very beginning, even before we get to the shadow, you have to have the will to want to heal yourself as well, I think. I don't think you can just come upon it. You can't just come upon your shadow. You have to actually, you know, take the steps and want to actually do something about your life, and start that process of introspection before any of that can happen anyway. So it's that will to want to change as well, isn't it?
It's everything to do with that. In fact, the word healing is key when we actually start talking more about the anima.
Yeah.
Healing is absolutely almost top of the list there, like creativity is as well. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, so I know one of the ways that I worked with my animus was in dreams. I started seeing the masculine within my dreams and started to work out what they were doing and what they were saying to me, through kind of symbolically anyway. And that was really the way that I kind of started to recognize, and I started to draw a lot of pictures of men in, you know, the way that I draw. And through the process of drawing, for me, I don't know if you see my drawings, but they're lines. A lot of them are lines. I have to kind of shift the page, and there's a lot of thinking. It takes a long time. So within the process of me doing that was, you know, all of this stuff going on in my head, kind of like a dream state. Almost like I fell between a story. It wasn't at the beginning or the end, it was the middle. And some of it made no sense. So it's kind of that process of spending time and effort and kind of going into my imagination. And I can't even really tell you where that took me, but it's just that process of kind of being in that sort of imaginal realm. I think I've heard it referred to as. So going through that process and working through my dreams and seeing what they were doing to me, chasing, being the perpetrator, not liking me very much. And then I had to kind of think about then the active imagination part and kind of confronting the dream within another dream, which is actually meditation. And so then kind of working through that and then opening myself up to whatever emotions that come up through that as well, which for me wasn't easy. For anyone, it's not easy. But that was the way that I did it. So what I found in the end was that my animus was lacking. Let's just say was lacking. He was lacking really good sort of masculine traits, and so I had to then sort of readdress him and sort of redress him with lots of different sort of positive male attributes. And then I had to think about doing that for myself as well. So what male attributes was I missing at the time to try and get a balance of the animus within me. So I'm just kind of showing you this is how I did it. And it sounds about right compared to what I've read from Jung. But it's the way that I did it. Perhaps other people have done it different ways. Can I ask you how you might have worked with your anima?
Oh, the anima, the
Very
female?
personal question.
The female aspect, the
yeah.
feminine? Jesus, that's huge. I mean, that is absolutely huge. Yeah, and one of the questions we got, from your viewers was about that, and it seemed just a little bit, and maybe I'm wrong here, but it seemed like the person was gonna, where's that manual? Where's that A to Z?
Yeah.
About how I do it,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm glad that question got asked, because as a matter of fact, we all know that there isn't any, and even what Jung had written. Right, he always stressed was guideposts, guidelines, and he encouraged people to get out to nature. He did. He retired at that lake in Bollingen.
Mm-hmm.
Here he was at the height of his fame, and he could have been just like Steiner, nearly carried off a stage, actually in a stretcher. But he didn't. He said, no, I've said what I had to say. I've written my works, and then I'm going to leave it to the world. And what he meant there was, we're not going to make an A to Z spinner rack guide to kind of thing. And the point there was that everyone has to come into it in their own way. And for me, it was very much a thing of nature, right? And in many cases, I probably would have ended up, in prison or in jail if I hadn't got away, from Ireland, where enormous changes were taking place to the natural environment. So much so that I probably would have been an activist, but at that point, and an activist in a way that would have definitely not done me any, favors. Would have been in serious trouble, like a hunt saboteur type, that type, but well-meaningly. But when I've come back and forth and seen what happened in Britain, what's happened in Ireland, I couldn't have stood it. And many, in a way, going to America, I've always felt was, that was one of the boons. As much as I wanted to stay in nature, having you, and you lived in Ireland as well. You lived in the countryside. You must know, the desecration was just extreme. And so nature was probably the key. Music is also a very big part for me, of that, and paying attention to your dreams. There's so many different things, but I would say for me, it was mostly digging into nature, being in nature, but also then being a musician in the sense of using that like a creative thing. Because when we talk about Anima, it'll be very much about creativity. She awakens creativity. That is one of the influences that's palpable. Because when I said that, it's hard to find their influence, I didn't say it didn't mean there was no influence, right? The shadow definitely influences us, and the Anima does influence, but it's not aware. Most people aren't aware that this is some voices within yourself, the manifold, polyvalent voices within you, that archetypes are many, right? And we just think of one voice in our heads. Usually that's another mistake. There's many voices in our heads. There, like there's many selves to the ancient Gnostics and Hermeticists and Egyptians and whatever. So it's really about, the Anima isn't about rebelling against society or anything like it, but it definitely comes under the heading of creativity. So the more, and even this other work that I'm doing, I've always seen it as pretty much a creative thing. That's where it's directed from. It's not directed with any agenda to help the world or anything like that. It's more, you know, an issue of my own creativity coming to bear, what there is of it, because I've always been interested in that, you know, always been a deep admirer of creative people, and then wanting to in some way follow in their footsteps, you know. My work in the tarot would be hugely a thing that, you know, look how present the Anima, and there's so many female cards right in the major arcana. So yeah, definitely through artwork, through esotericism, through reading Steiner, you know, being part of a Krishnamurti background since I was very young. All of this was honing you in to the non-urban, you know, system. Wonderfully, you know, so there was an aspect of that. There's definitely an aspect of being sensitive to nature would have been a role in my life for sure. You know, and then of course, in the more hard terms, it's always your relationships with women at that point, starting with the mother, right, and moving out, girlfriends, whatever, right, starting in school, and that helps you then find out your type. You know, typology is very important here, and also the influence of physical women in your life would be, you know, as I say, if people are coming in for the first time, it's hard to hear the esoteric side. Well, then just the physical from nursery school on, you know, what is the influence of different girls, right? And I remember my teachers were female. This is in the 60s. So that this hippie look, you know, the long straight hair, you know, the maxi skirts or even the mini skirts, the certain smell, right? So all of that's coming into your life, and all the other women that may surround you in your life, family, friends, and so on. You know, what is that all about? And is it something repellent to you, you know, or is it something warm, friendly, you know, caring and loving, right? And all of that. So all of those experiences will add up, so that even if you meet somebody sort of more terrible later on, or somebody in the midst, it won't really matter if you know, generally the women who are around you and looking after you are decent souls who, you know, exude a healthy femininity. You know, that'll make all the difference in the world.
There's also the thing about relationships as well, like perhaps some reoccurring problems in relationships that can also lead us to our shadow as well, can't it? I mean, if we keep on finding ourselves in the same kind of situation in relationships, let's just say, so a woman who kind of always finds herself with a emotionally avoidant male, for example, you know, what is it in that woman? What is she trying to gain from that, you know, from that person, and why did that happen? You know, then you can kind of go back to the parent and say, well, was the father avoidant emotionally? And is there, you know, that recognition, is that very familiar to you? So in that way, you can kind of start to sort of build a road and find out, you know, why the attraction is there. So that's really digging into the unconscious, isn't it? About what's guiding our perceptions and our thoughts and our actions, and then ultimately our experience as well.
That's right. Remember, when it comes to the Anima's role, healer is huge. You know, when we move forward now from what I said about the world, when you move into the human domain, the women you knew, were they hard? Were they cold? Were they indifferent? Were they frigid? Were they warm? Right? At this point, our collective experience throughout the millennia, right, definitely enables the healing aspect to predominate, right? And therefore, in a man, when he's looking to the woman, he's also looking to that healer. This is huge, right? That's where we get the word matron, you know, also being a synonym for the healer, right? And so you're right. There's certain, on a semiotic level, this is like before the child even becomes conscious. You know, it's a beautiful thing that, you know, the feminist writer Julius Kristeva brought to the table when she was critiquing Freud, right? Freud had your, you know, you had your oral, the anal, and the phallic, and then a sort of a latency period as we move 7 years. Julia Kristeva, probably basing it a lot on Otto Rank, had discovered that there was an earlier fourth, you know, or first it would be, level, and that was a semiotic. And this was a huge discovery, right? That even before there's a kind of a conscious awareness at the very early stages of the Oedipus, even before that, there's a recognition of the world on what she called the semiotic level. And the other three, the Freudian levels, are called symbolic, just for convenience, right? Because different centers of the brain have opened now. There's lots of changes biophysically. But before that, in the most impressionable stage of a child's life, and this is happening to children born right now, is this semiotic, in which it's a lot of impressions, right? It's almost even, it's sensual, but it's almost pre-sensual. There's something going on that's going to fade. In all human beings, it'll be there, but it'll be very, very deep down. And there's no question of any return to it. In many ways, we're permanently estranged from it, you know, and as even Freud would admit, after the Oedipus, we're even estranged from that level of innocence. There's so many deaths right? But way back there, there's a connection to the anima. And that's where I think a lot of this comes from. And so when you get a fixation that needs to be broken, yeah, you know, it's like some philosopher said that the female, you know, sort of blunts the male's will in a good way, right? Not so blunted that he becomes soft, but blunted so that he's not a total maniac, right? There's a softening that takes place, and that's what the woman's role is. And it's the same in terms of the anima. So the healing aspect of a fixation, and that can be through a what's known as an anima fixation, right? An anima possession, you know, which is a kind of a neurotic trait. And that would take, you know, hours to explain, right? Because this then goes back into things like the dragon fight. Maybe we'll touch a bit on that later. But it can even happen to a male. The dragon fight is not just between a mother and her daughter. It can also be between the male child as well. And so trying to then, that can dominate the consciousness so much. In other words, the, you know, the negative it's not even a projection at that point. The negative possession of a person's consciousness, and then the subsequent projection. What you're trying to do is salvage, right, who the real person is there, this woman you've met. Stop projecting, you know, mother on her or whatever it might be. And so that's what appears to be a fixation, when this mind is trying its hardest to detach, but, you know, often fails in that. And don't forget, there can be it takes two hands to clap. There may be a woman out there that you meet who's themselves in some way, you know, neurotic and fixated, and doesn't mind those projections. You know about the stories about these women who can't leave abusive husbands and all the rest of it, right? That's definitely a two hands to clap situation here. Not normally accepted by society, but then so what, right? It is accepted by the highest psychologists in the land. So yeah, when it comes to the pathology, we definitely maybe should touch on that toward the end, because once we talk more about these archetypes, because the pathology that comes when you haven't integrated these things correctly, and the non-integration can start at that semiotic level. The treatment of the mother, right, and then moving into the eatable stages. If the parents are messed up, integration is going to be nigh on impossible. Unless, as I said before, you've got other, you know, people in your life who represent more of the healthy version, and then it can happen, and you'll be saved. You know, but Jesus, that's not the case with everybody.
No. So what does animus and anima possession look like?
Yeah, can we leave that a little bit, because yeah, we should have so much more to say about them, because it won't make any sense. Let's leave pathology, make a note, you know, toward the end, because then other things we'll say when they go wrong. But let's lay down some of the things that are positive first, you know, and then maybe touch on the pathology, because that would just branch off, and we'd never get to say anything good about any of these archetypes. Well,
let's talk about what is good about what can we actually gain from integration with our anima and animus.
Oh yeah, well, again, as I say, it's necessary for homeostasis, pure and simple, right? Think of every archetype in its simplest terms as a way of seeing. So and that's really what they are. That's not just some euphemistic statement. The shadow is a way of seeing when it dominates, right? The anima is a way of seeing, and that way of seeing can differ from the animus, right? And different from the wanderer and the orphan and the wild man and the hero, right? They're all ways of seeing. So we are multiple voices, and we're not living in a culture that addresses that. In fact, that's considered schizophrenia today, tantamount to that. Tantamount to a disorder, for goodness sake, right? Now, the job of the ego is to sit at a round table with all of these ways of seeing and try in some way to find the commonality in the way of seeing, right? So as many voices becoming one. It's absolutely incredible, right? And, you know, the shadow will have its own way of seeing, which is that it's very focused on what is false, you know. In fact, in the broadest existential way, the shadow itself is manufactured as a voice against all of the false, but the false wins and suppresses what we know as the shadow. Right? The shadow is a way of seeing. People call it a shadow realm, and there's a lot of truth in that too, because it's the negative elements of ourselves pushed into a certain, you know, corner of the room, into a shadowy grotto. So there's truth to that too, but I prefer it again to be saying this is a way of seeing that is not congruent with, you know, the way the world is. Then the anima has her way of seeing, you know, and then and so we are really literally taking on and off glasses every time you work with an anima. It's offering you the glasses. And that's an awful lot of work bioenergetically. So we make a lot of decisions to shut down, and that's what would also lead to fixation, where we go, this is all too much trouble. I'll just pick you, right? Why? Did anybody, who said that? The whole idea is that you're meant to have them all, 9, 13, different visions. There's 12 in the zodiac. There's 10 or 11 in the Kabbalah. You got 4 from Jung, which is mostly a stripped down thing of these esoteric, disciplines and so on. So at the very least, you've got 4, and at the max, you've got, there was even talk of, 36 in some schools, right, of the zodiac and what have you. So these are all your personalities, and it's really, really incredible. Think of it in this way. The shadow is often considered the negative. This is how it's described times, as the negative within us, the negative parts of ourselves that society wants to censor, doesn't approve of, the parents. Whoa, stop. Who is it who's determining what is negative, even when it's internalized into ourselves, right? So you must have some objective aspect of the personality who agrees with the status quo, saying, yes, that's right, that's a negative aspect. Is it? Who I'm interested not only, in the shadow now, I'm interested in who is articulating that this or that trait of one's own personality is negative and needs to be repressed. What do we know about that voice? You see, so in my work, right, it's existentially based, the superego, right, comes into play now, because that's classically the job of the superego. It's the superego who's the sergeant major. Well, that's called the social self, right? The persona, as Jung would have called it. And it is the true psychic reason for fragmentation, not the shadow. The shadow is the consequence, the victim, for goodness sake. So in existential psychology, there's actually a shift of focus, moving on from where Jung had left off. And he was, if you read him closely, you'll find he was in agreement with this. Then that leads to further questions like, say, then if the superego, which we consider the voice of morality, social morality, then how does that equal, right, or equate with the conscience? Are they both the same? Then you find out they're not the same. All right, so now we got a split between the voice of morality as it manifests in accordance with society's morality, starting with the parents, and the real conscience. What do we know about that? So here's a voice that censors, we know nothing about, the superego. And here is a conscience that, obviously serves the self, doesn't want to succumb to the voice of the superego. What do we know about those structures? So psychology suddenly takes on, and it's all about self-restoration and self-awareness and revelation in a way. But why our societies have decided we don't want to know about this is because, as I said, it's too much work. And all of this, what we're talking about, will demand then breaking away from that social norm, breaking away from the mass mind, right? Because you can't find conscience if the noise in your head is the mass mind. So it will entail a physical and psychic alienation. It will mean that you have to become the outsider, right? And question everything. And that's just way too much work. We don't even know what kind of consciousness would then grow out of that. Once we do break away, we'll have to develop a different conscience that doesn't heed the world, the will of the world. And also, we'll talk about this more when we get to Animus. Do we even have the will to endure? The raw, will. Could it sustain us for more than a week? If we ever took to that kind of road. Everybody wants it. Everybody rebels. Everybody shaves their hair and puts a, pin through their nose. That's not rebellion. That's just the, the weekend warrior version. Could somebody really go on the Siddhartha road and permanently break away? What kind of consciousness would they have? What kind of willpower might they need? You see, so. And where would they get it, even if they did desire it, like you said in the beginning?
But this is the really difficult road to individuation, isn't it? It's about really becoming an individual in your own right and having a look and seeing what the things that you really believe, do you really believe them? And can you break away from society and the mainstream narrative? And can you make up your own mind about what's right and what's wrong? And how do things really feel to you? So it's a big ask. And I think also, I think if you do go down that road, you have to be ready to say goodbye to most of your friends, actually. And maybe even, I don't know, some of your family even, to really be
definitely
who you really are. And it's very difficult in society to break away from that, and not everyone wants to do it, and not everyone will.
That's right. And that's working with the shadow. So a lot of questions we got had to do with that. I can sum it up in a couple of lines, and that is that the shadow is the part of us, right, that exists precisely because it's aware of the false, right? When it comes, in other words, the shadow is a response to the falsity of the world and of other people, right? That's what it is. And so it's not something you want to get rid of, just like Nietzsche warned. because it is the last vestige of independence within you. So rather than seeing it as negative, because we ask, who keeps shining that light? Come out from the, stage exit left, and show yourself, and that may be good, that may be bad. Maybe there's a reason to call some aspects of the self. I'm not, taking one side or the other. I'm just saying Jung has left enough to show us that there's an aspect which is daemonic in a positive sense, right? There's negative daemonic and positive dynamic. So just as much as we need to integrate all the archetypes in order to be, or the ways of seeing of the archetypes in order to be whole. Yeah, but the shadow's way of seeing is fuck the world. They're all wrong. How can you adjust? Might not that integration of the shadow change your life and make you an Einstein suddenly? Because a lot of the greatest people we know in our world had to do precisely that in order to be great. I can list them for endlessly, right? They weren't conformists. William Shakespeare was no conformist, right? Miguel Cervantes and so many others I can mention. They're defined by the fact that they were anti-conformists to one level of another, right? To different degrees, of course, right? But the thing is that critic of society, that's the shadow, said, I'll point it out to you, right? And you go, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. And that makes for a genius. That the anima is all about creativity, but it doesn't mean it's, good creativity. It could just be slop. It might be just something fine for the individual. It doesn't mean it's going to have that earth-shattering universal feel, right? So the shadow, I think, is an extremely important aspect. And often when you go to these Jungians, right? We were talking about this before. These Debbie Fords and all, they're way off base, right? They haven't the faintest idea about what we're talking about. And so they're sort of therapies, if you want to call them that deal with the shadow. They're West Coast. This is Beach Boy Disney's treatment of the shadow, right? Mostly, as I say, erasing it until another dynamic happens where all the archetypes become daemonic in the worst sense, which is antagonistic. You can maybe touch on that as well later. But when you don't integrate the archetypes, hell awaits. The lack of integration is showing all around us right now. Even in this present fiasco, it's going to be entirely analyzed through Jung's teachings and general, psychology, and certainly through existential psychology. Everything we're looking at, the need for a father figure, right? The breaking down of old false patterns and systems that maybe need to be reset. But look at the panic, as everybody, the familiar. Familiar what? Sure, it's all lies and has been from the beginning. What's familiar about it, right? Don't you have tower struck with lightning ring any bells? Sometimes in order to have, sanity and real sanity, a reset has to take place. We're already overdue in our civilization for the fall. What the hell, right? Civilizations come and go. We're already overdue in this one. What are people crying about?
I think, well, for myself and the other people that I know who are sort of alternative researchers and who are interested in all the different ideas, the thing is we just don't know what's happening, and we don't know what the end game is going to be. And I think it's just that uncertainty actually that makes people feel a little bit panicky. I'd say panicky. But then most people outside, they believe the mainstream narrative. They believe that there's this deadly virus that's going to kill everyone. But then when you start looking into alternative research, there's lots of various different information about what could be possibly happening. That we might have this Jesus type character who's already in our political system, who's going to kind of save the world. I'm also in contact with a few people from the group who do a lot of, let's just say they've grown in consciousness, and they have connections to, I don't know, other realms, it seems. And a lot of them are talking about this Jesus-like fellow coming down from the clouds and saving us all. So, and this seems to be something that's happening within the sort of New Age community. But there are a lot of people talking about this kind of Jesus character coming in and saving everyone. I don't know if then there's also the Agenda 21, and there's also a New World Order coming in. So there's all these different ideas about what it could potentially be. I mean, no one's happy with the way it has been, but no one knows where this is really going. And I guess this is what makes people feel a bit uncomfortable. So can I ask you, so you spoke recently about bombs being put around. I mean, so what do you think could be the possible end game, now that we've kind of spoken about it a little bit? What do you think could be the possible end game?
Yeah, there is that problem. I totally stand by that. I haven't been able to produce evidence because it was just, had to say that you know, we had to only deal with that subject in a highly shortened, but that's a tremendous worry, and it's a tremendous story. And men in the senior positions of intelligence organizations have been assassinated, literally, because they found out about this, right? I'll be going into all of this. But yeah, the dirty bombs has been put in here since about the 80s, systematically put in places in the West. And I look to this time right now as one of the things that collaterally could be happening is that they've been discovered, and that communism in general, whether it's the Islamo-communism manifestation, Chinese communism, and all of its other derivative ones, like, you know, because communists are ensconced now in all of the different agencies of the West. This doesn't just mean the World Health Organization, that's pretty high up, but down the ladder, up the ladder. And so we must strike against it. In some way, we have to get rid of this pestilence because it's eating away at the, you know, Western structures, and it's manifold. So in that conversation, I was only able to talk about the Islamo-communism aspect of it, you know, and these dirty bombs, right? And the professors who've done it, and the funding that came even from Putin and other people. Like, that's a credible story. We're going to be going into it on Enslaved in Great Depth. But there's also other branches of this communistic, you know, aspect. Hillary Clinton is a dyed-in-the-flesh communist. Just because they happen to be super wealthy and living in the West doesn't mean that they're doesn't mean they're capitalists themselves or in favor of capitalism. Quite the reverse. So when she got a bloody nose when Mr. Trump got in, that lit the fuse, that the blue touch paper, so to speak. Not just that, but that was huge. And they're recriminating against him. Obama didn't like being ousted. Hillary Clinton didn't like being ousted, right? So that group that they control, and it is powerful, obviously, has tried to, you know, they're irrational. They're probably even psychotic. And so their, you know, reprisals were on the agenda. And this is one of them, right? Then China, we don't need to go into that, right? But what I was trying to emphasize in my work is that take all of these bloody noses, the one that he put tariffs on China as well, and he's done several other things in the name of the West, and that's all very good. And of course, these psychotics will want to reprise. That should be axiomatic. But what I tried to do in my work was take it back to the way that this man even got in the first place in 16 and before, right? Where did he come from, right? And my only theory is that he's a paleo-conservative, and he was thrown up by the paleo-conservatives, who now they're not the deep state, but they're the deep right. Let's just put it that way, right? And this deep right has started to mobilize itself. And the reason why they mobilize themselves, and this is again speculation, but it is based on wide reading. And the reason why they're mobilizing themselves is because they realize that communism is mobilizing itself, right? And this is all behind the scenes. Not only in the form of radical Islam, but in other forms as well, probably in China. They know this through their intelligence agents who warn them ahead of time. And so Mr. Trump got in because of that intelligence that came to the fore. He gets in because that group of people, the deep right, want a man to be in the seat of power when, right, all the things that are going to happen that their intelligence is telling them. So they knew that. What it really means is that they knew about 5-6 years ago, if not more, and they mobilized then. And Donald Trump is the first physical result of it. The first, you know, he comes onto the world stage, you know, and myself, I took that as like, there's more to this, you know, the more to the getting rid of the Democrats. It's probably, and I was hoping it would be a small domino effect, you know, a small effect that would create a domino effect that leads to pretty much where we are now. So despite all of the furore, all the histrionics in the streets and people's fear, I have been also sort of aware that this might be the final mobilization of the deep right. Now that causes another reaction on the other side with the deep left, right? Because one is reading the other and one is spying on the other. There's spies deeply ensconced within different groups. So the left realize what's happening, and the right, because they're seeing what's taking place. So they're prompted to do something, and do something irrational. And this could be that, right? If they did get a bloody nose in the meantime from the discovery of these weapons, that's even more. Now they get a bloody nose again. Well, say you got Hillary not getting in, right? You got the seizure of these weapons, or at least the discovery of where they are. You've got tariffs, right? You've got other strictures that the presidency is bringing down. Can't think of them anymore right now, but there have been several. And then you've got this reaction from the left in Bolshevik communism, right? In Bolshevik China. Now, all reactions often are, by the very definition that they're reactions, incompetent. They're not really that planned. So if some loon, right, up there, who's already probably even in his dotage, let alone senile, pulled the handle, you know, and pressed the red switch to start this, you know, this mobilization, well, it didn't really work, thank goodness, right? And the most communist of the countries, the most social of the countries, were the last to act. Britain, Sweden, anybody remember them, right? They're the last to act, yeah, because these are the most socialistic, dyed-in-the-flesh countries that any shutting of the borders or any action would have been against China. Well, we're not against China, says Canada and Britain and Sweden, because we're communists, we're like them. So we don't act so that people will know, oh yeah, China's an enemy that's attacked us. So what I'm telling you has, verifiable proof. The last countries to act against this thing are the most socialistic on the planet. Doesn't take a rocket scientist to work that out, because again, they're so in the pocket, right, of world communism that they won't even save their own people by reacting, because that's going to be considered racist. And the media all got behind that. But I'm looking at it going, yeah. So I'm just hoping now that there'll be even further mobilization, up to the point of even the installation of martial law. I think people think that's crazy, but that's because you don't know the enemy and how powerful they are and what they do to us in retaliation, and probably what they've already done. A couple of people died in 9/11. People who get horrified by that. And we went to war over that. That's nothing compared to the deaths of innocent men and women today. How people are not irate and screaming about that is beyond belief, But again, I'm just hoping that yesterday, Mr. Trump declared that he was, ceasing funding for the World Health Organization. That's an extremely elite, an extremely high-placed, organization, and it's a great sign. It's still half that needs to be done, but it is a good sign that he means business. And I'm just hoping every single day that, there'll be more mobilization against China and the world communism. And if there is, you're going to soon see that, my goodness, finally we're able to, get rid of a poison that has been entering into the schools, that's been entering into the media, this political correctness that's infecting every state in America, where they're unleashing hordes of prisoners, dangerous felons. They are making cities safe cities for a horde of very, very dangerous people, and all of these lunatic things that have happened in the world. Right? We'll start to see the cleanup. He said about draining the swamp. This is the real draining of the swamp. The swamp is communism, and that's the one that needs to be drained. And I just keep hoping that every day when I wake up that, this is exactly what is happening. And it's my duty to then inform the audience whether they accept it or not. Is their business. Not everybody knows that communism is a threat. Everyone thinks communism died away years ago. Nothing could be further from the truth. It just hybridized, but it hybridized in things that are very, very, vile. And look at the state of Canada. So, I'm looking to the ending of that so that we can actually get back to some traditional structures finally, which are Western based.
My goodness. Well, I guess we just have to wait and see what the end game is going to be. And let's just hope it's for the best of humanity. Because even a few weeks ago, I wasn't online so much. I was kind of feeling like, my goodness, what is really happening here? And I was getting these different stories. I was thinking, really, is there a place for shadow work? Am I wasting my time now? It just seems so insignificant compared to what's actually happening out there. But the last week especially, I just thought, well, you know what? Everyone's home now. So this is probably the best time for us to start introspecting. The other thing is that, being at home, we're with our families, problems come up and, we're kind of able to see ourselves through our families and our partners and stuff like that. So this is probably a very good time to start introspecting before, hopefully, we see some huge, much better change in the world that's much needed right now for us.
Yeah, and shadow work is all about this. Shadow work, as I said, is calling the false the false. And there's other astrological things that are doing exactly that, but in a very ramped up way. So it does make things very sensitive because it breaks the monotony. It breaks the cycle of mediocrity that everybody's caught in and forces them back on the existential issues. This is all shadow work taking place right now. And again, communism as a paradigm is over, right? And so it needs to be over. And it needs somebody to give it a push. Back in 14, 15, 16, all that histrionics of the snowflakes in the streets and all the these causes and crusades, that's also something that the left initiated while they're folding up, while they're packing up their bags and, and stuffing cash into their pockets and trying to exit to wherever they're going to exit. Often they create a few fires down below, right? And when I saw all these incendiary, anarchistic types running the streets, I took that as a sign that upstairs, a lot of packing noises are being heard, right? And I've been expecting that for years. I did a podcast called The Dying Conspiracy where we touched on this a little bit. And remember, any level of any podcasting or, it can only be a very brief utterance as well, because these things are vast subjects. But in short, I feel that all of that histrionics and unleashing you know, of mayhem in the streets. And anybody who's lived in Los Angeles will know exactly that's what it is, right? The nihilists and the anarchists have been very much released, right? So why though? It's because while the fires are burning downstairs, right, the elites who've created world chaos, and they are addicts of world chaos, they are the architects of world chaos, they're packing up to get out. That's what's really happening. So when you hear these monkeys and this movement talk about the global elite is finished, global elite, can you use any less vague a term? Try communist elite. See, because these are leftists themselves trying to throw dust. Like you said, it's very complicated. Well, this movement is now jam-packed full of pinkos, socialists, and outright communists. And they've been mobilized to throw disinformation out on the internet. So they use vague terms like global elite is coming down, global elite, this and that, and other ones as well. And it means nothing. They're actually anti the group that I'm talking about, right? The deep rich, the deep right. That group is mobilizing now, and it's for the good of the West. Finally, which they'd mobilized years ago. But the other side now mobilizes with the help of the complicit media to keep on demonizing this group. And they've already broken our morale through Facebook and through other groups. You know, they've broken normal Western people's morale about the structures of the West until we see them as nothing but evil. And they wanted that. That's the drip feed system for years. Doesn't mean I'm an advocate of everything in the West. I see that. I've studied the, you know, aberrations of the Western way for years, and I've been speaking on it right down into the deep psychology that nobody else has followed me down there. Nobody else wants to talk about any of these things, right? But they pertain, don't they? Everything tracks back to the psychology, doesn't it? But what the hell? And there's not a single person out there, you know, in this movement who should be talking about it, who is. So, you know, there you have that. But there's mobilizations on both sides. And so that thugocracy being unleashed into the streets told me that there's trouble upstairs. And the few of the last hardcore Bolsheviks, most who do live in actual China, by the way, there's an interesting part, but they've got their counterparts in, you know, in South Korea and places like that. So this is the last ditch attempt. And then when they found that their paradigm is busted and that, you know, it's time to end, being psychotic, they say, okay, I'll go, but not without taking as many of the enemy with me as I can. And also not, you know, the people even in my own country who've never really wholly signed on. I don't care how many of you die. And so this is the pulling of the lever, you know, while the capsule, you know, leaves the sinking ship. This is how I read this. You know, but further action needs to be taken against them. There definitely should be reparations. There should be a lot more than reparations. You know, there should be absolute attack on China. And that'll take out the headquarters of the world, you know, conspiracy, the real one, not the global elite, the real communist elite, the word they all can't use, right? And that will take it out. And then all the other subsidiary little groups, you see, will of themselves fizzle and fade and turn coat. And this is what we need. It's far beyond time that we need this, actually. So I've never looked at any of the stuff that's happening now with an ounce of panic. You know, to me, I just pray every day that it's going to be this. And, you know, sacrifices are then for, you know, justifiable in that regard.
Wow. Okay. So let's just hope that this is going to be the case. So let's get back to the Anima and Animus. So you spoke about integrating the archetypes and that being a really important fixture in knowing the Anima and Animus. So how would you go about doing this? And how many archetypes are there? And are archetypes mini stereotypes?
Yeah, they affect, they work through us. It's an incredible it's an incredible reciprocal relationship between the world outside and the content of the unconscious. When it comes to the archetypes, remember, they're considered objective to the ego, meaning they're considered as foreign, right, as objective worldly stuff is. This is one of Jung's greatest discoveries, that all the content of the unconscious is so pushed away and in one sense alienated, dissociated, right, that it is considered as foreign to us as the external content. So what this means is that's the secret of neurosis. That's why there is pathology. We'll talk about that at the end, but just a word to say about it. If a tsunami crashed through our physical house, right, it damages our physical house and we become, you know, disorientated and panicky and scared by that. Same thing with the unconscious. If content is forcibly comes into the ego conscious, it has the same effect, only we call that neurotic, right? We become, and so most of our society is neurotic today. Leading, like I said, psychology is so much a part of this. That's what I meant when I just said a few seconds ago that everything happening politically today is psychological. Mm-hmm. Now we have unpacked that because it's people's refusal to integrate psychologically that causes this meltdown and any other meltdown that you could think, right up to the state of war. All right, none of it would exist as a phenomena without repression, without dissociation, without fragmentation. Now, to answer your question more succinctly, though, since the superego, we've established that the superego is the aspect that creates a shadow. The shadow is trying to do healthy stuff, which is introduces to falsity, socially and existentially, right? Falsity. Falsity of the mother, falsity of the father, the hypocrisy of society, the neighbors, the schools. The shadow is the part of us that's trying but what we do is we say, shut up, shadow, we're going to chain you to the wall. You're under gag order, you can't speak. So then the superego is now free to fragment the self into all of these different parts. The archetypes are trying to bring the opposite. They're trying to have you think holistically. They're trying to have you feel holistically, right? And then, but the superego is demanding that they fragment. Now that they have to fragment, now that psychic content has to fragment, it breaks up into different voices. The self has to represent itself through broken archetypes, right? So even the archetypes, how to say this? It's more like, again, speaking generally, without diving into the Animus and Animus yet specifically, and we definitely want to do that. But the thing is that the archetypes, first of all, we have to understand, they operate synthetically, right? A complementarity is the word I'm looking for. Normally, in a normal, beautiful, healthy society, not the village that we're in right now, Patrick McGowan's village, but in a normal, healthy society that's organic, ruled over by people like Steiner and others, right? Walter Russell and whoever else. Then the archetypal voices within will be harmonious and they'll act in a complementary, with complementarity. Since that is not the case, we don't hear the voice of the self directly, then the self has to send out these agents. So anima, animus, shadow, and the other ones, the wanderer, the orphan, the hero, the wild man, the fool, right? Sort of jester archetype and what have you. They are now coming individually, because the keyhole is so small, right, that only can push through a few notes. So there's been this fragmentation is also co-opted then by the psyche. So, well, you're all fragmented now. We've got to, we've got to go through this incredible border guards in order to get any of the messages through that we need. So there is a fragmentation that's co-opted, right? And we get little piecemeal stuff shoved under the door, so to speak. And this is all by our own choice, by the way, right? But it's also largely to do with society. But the archetypes themselves are syncretic and synthetic, and they work in a complementary way. The reason why they do that is because they are merely emanations of what's, well, David Bohm would have called it the implicate order. Beautiful term, right? They're agents of that. I call it the template of wholeness, right? A totem. Because the center of being, the center of oneself is always attuned with the whole, the implicate order. But since we don't want to have anything to do with that, and we've lost that way of seeing, it fragments, but still works the way it usually did it, which is to bring us back to wholeness, right? Nature would be one of those wholes. We talked about that earlier on. But consciousness needs to be whole, right? And as we said, the content of the unconscious. So really what the way to say it is this, that now the dynamic is that the archetypes, we already said that they were going to be objective to the ego consciousness, the ego structure. How people often feel archetypes in their life is that they have a will of their own, right? Because we've so alienated them that we now imagine they're working by this strange, will of their own. They come when they want. They're very disruptive to our world. You know what I mean? And of course they are, because they're not integrated. And they can run the ego aground. Mm-hmm. So in a social setting like you're seeing now, or in an individual's own moments, you can feel run aground. You can feel overwhelmed or flooded. And of course, the archetypes have many ways of bringing about pathology, but it's not them that's bringing it about. They're really doing something that is always holistic up until a very extreme point. And I've talked about it in my work, right, where they become antagonistic. And there's halfway points to that. Halfway point to that would be neurosis. Halfway point of that would be an obsession with the father figure in order to gain stability, with boogaloo ideologies like Bolshevik communism, collectivism, right? We'll talk about the pathologies later, but this is some of them. And just this resistance of looking within. And then the individual gets neurotic because they feel they're under attack then. See, if the archetypes are considered working with a will of their own, then insomnia means you don't sleep. Well, right, because you don't want to go to sleep, because that's when the anima and the animus and the archetypes are speaking to you. So insomnia is just one reaction to the inability to say, I don't want to dream. I don't want to face myself. I'm not introverted. I'll just have all the lights on and the TV blaring. And then even when I refuse to go into the theta state. I refuse to go deeper than, the states that I'm in, the beta state, as they call it, and all of that. It's basically functionally insane. I'll remain functionally insane. I'll hide in the light. And our society allows us to do that, which tells an intelligent person that the society is a completely, what do you call it, accessory before, during, and after the fact. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so what we have around us now is mostly just functional. If they're not insane, they're unsane, but they're functional. Functionally dysfunctional. They keep breeding, keep drinking the booze, heading over there for politics and anywhere the collective gathers, because they need reinforcement, they need amplification of the unsane states, and all the rest of it.
Right, so I wanted to ask you about this. So an integrated anima and animus means a balance of both masculine and feminine energies within us. And there's been a lot of talk about the divine masculine and divine feminine. I should really be doing that, divine. When I first learned about divine feminine, probably about maybe 8 years ago or so, when I was really into like New Age stuff, they were talking a lot about the end of patriarchy and how this was going to somehow propel women forward. And it was a long time coming. And that they wanted to kind of do away with like patriarchy and put sort of femininity. But I want to ask you, what do you think is real and true divine masculine and divine feminine, or at least, real masculine feminine energies?
Well, can we start then with the anima and get to the animus? Mm-hmm. We'll do this because it fits psychology. Shadow first, right? What was that? What did Jung say, that the one standing closest behind the shadow is the anima? Is a direct quote. Okay, right. And therefore you have to meet the shadow, and that's just because you're not a self until you do. Right? There's something about the anima and the animus which are deeper archetypes which we can't even integrate or converse with. It would be all this static, because you're not an integrated self, and therefore the shadow elements, like I said, this room in which all these negatives of yourself have been put and banished. You have to, you've got to reintegrate those, and then I think the anima and animus are still working with you to a degree. It's not like a complete apartheid, right? But you're never going to come into you're never going to come into the communion that you need with them without doing the shadow, because it'll always be interfering with you otherwise. So if we were living in a positive, pro-psychological instead of an anti-psychological age, we would be doing shadow work pretty much from, from the 7 years old. And we're not. And we would be developing the feeling, that Jung and Hillman and all of these other people have asked. But if we talk about the anima first, as we said, it's really a constellation of our ancestral memories of nature, right? Not all good, not all good, but there has been very, very positive. And don't forget, as we said earlier, that, it's chthonic. The actual roots. I mean, where does our bodies go after we're dead? People haven't noticed, right? The real root of being is the soil, is the mud, right? That's the true ground, is nature and this planet. So the anima takes its origin from there. Later on, it gets admixture of the stereotypical, as you rightly said, in the form of mother and grandmother and woman in general, right? And then it builds out from that point on until there is supernatural elements, like Sophia and all of that, built in. That comes a bit later, right? But it includes so much. It includes, as we said, creativity, right? So that your relationship with the world will never only be rational and intellectual in just that strict sense, And then the way I look at it as well, when you talk about how the anima affects relationships, if you step back and even get into how we get a relationship, you're back to that question of empathy, right? Because you can't have a relationship with anything or anyone if there's not even a level of empathy, right? The empathy which exists within the self to the self is now extended outwards, we're cutting things very short here, but it's extended outwards to other people, partly for survival, and then it, moves on to interest, a different level of interest in other people, a genuine one, right? Now, empathy then is in philosophy known as intentionality, or should be anyway, right? Intentionality means a normal, natural leaning out toward the world. That's what our five senses are a manifestation of. We wouldn't have our five senses unless there was already an inbuilt, innate, not learned from the world, but an innate leaning out towards the other, leaning out towards nature, leaning out towards the world. Now that can be inhibited, of course, but again, we're not talking about the pathological aspects, right? The thing to add to this, which makes a lot of sense when you're dealing with the anima, is you're not just reaching out to nature in a raw physical, take a snapshot, put it in the coffee table book. I don't just mean on that level. And also I don't mean an empathy or a reaching out to normal people for, say, survival. It's all includes that, right? But there's a deeper reaching out to the mystery of nature. They're not the same thing, right? And then the anima, therefore, remember, all the archetypes are only partially known to consciousness, right? You know that, right? That the big difficulty about archetypes is that they're concealed, right? Consciousness can only apprehend a certain amount of the archetype. Mm-hmm. In other words, they are ambivalent, right? They don't express themselves openly, and they themselves are mysteries, mm-hmm. right? So now we're looking at a whole different phenomena. The archetypes are mysterious. We can see that's empirical because they don't commune with us 100%. They do so in dreams. They do through by symbolism. They do through flashes and deja vus and whatever, and moods, right? Right. So the mystery is an empirical thing at this point. That's why Jung is so important. Why he's so vitally important. Because mystery is no longer a mystery. Mystery is empirical part of our existence that we couldn't pluck out. Taking that one step further, we realize how mystery became mystery. Because we used to reach out, or leaning out to nature, encountered the mystery of nature, that which cannot be explained. And so mystery became an archetype. And the archetype that most embodies mystery and nature, now we have a profile on the anima. This is the road you go down, Okay, then we have this relationship with the anima the moment that we are astonished, the moment that we have awe, the moment that we step back and wonder and are still and quiet, right, and enamored by beauty and all of that. Anima is with us now. She's slowly being, negotiated. This is her language. And the leaning out aspect is part of it. The leaning out creates relationship. So she is the connecting tissue that leans out, not just a relationship with people, which as we know can turn problematic and ugly, not just a relationship with nature, which is, as I say, the more of the, holiday snapshot version of nature or whatever you might want to call it, or even a lot of, lower levels of art, which still includes nature. No. There's something so much more involved, which is the mystery of nature, all caps. So this is where the anima really arises, once you know what you're talking about, right? And there's the perpetual intentionality in which we reach out through the senses, through the eyes, right? Eye contact and all the rest of it. And so we have this need to know what a world is. But do you see how wrong then the physical, why I'm doing this is because now look at how quasi-mystical Jung becomes. Because all physicalists and materialists want to tell you, blank mind, world. And the world's impressions like darts on a board, right? Well, there has to still be a board, so they're a little bit wrong there. In order to have the sticky stuff that kids put on the board, you still need the board and has to have some faculties for that sticky stuff to adhere. We're not there yet. The physicalist doesn't even concede those levels of attributes to the mind. It's just total blank slate. Well, it's not blank. I've just established that if you can stick something to it, the board's a lot more than blank. Well, the mind is a lot more than just a passive receiver. Tell me more about its receptive qualities. See, but that's, Jung laughed at that stuff, right? No, and as any normal person would. We've already talked about an innate intentionality. This ability to even reach out to a world. So where this becomes so vitally important is this. You must already be wanting to know an external and an objective reality before it even has the chance of entering in. So that nobbles all your pathetic, absurd materialists and physicalists. The reaching out, the intentionality, otherwise known as empathy. Empathy, otherwise known as emotion. Otherwise known as feeling. The deep feeling being centered version. All of this is anima, working in your being, by the way. All of this is anima, what we're talking about. So this reaching out to a world already has to be there. Autistic children doesn't even move to drink a cup of water, right? They've tested this so many times. It's axiomatic. All over the world, they've tested, right? Melanie Klein was the greatest expert in it, but there's been hundreds of others since then. Test after test on autistic children, right? They're just like flaccid dolls. There's no intentionality there at all.
Yeah, and you know, also when you were saying that about nature, I'm also thinking of the word play as well. There's something, you know, you said that the anima is there when we seek out nature and stuff like that, but also the facility to play. And as adults, we don't play anymore. It's only really children that play. So I think even being in nature, picking up a stone, throwing it in the water, this is being playful. This is just being at one with our surroundings, isn't it?
Play is a way of investigating what nature is, right? Play is exactly that, because you throw the stone in the water and nature goes, here's some ripples to play with, right? In fact, what you're talking about is one of the essences of Heidegger's later work. We're not going to get into it, but Martin Heidegger used a great deal of the etymology of the word play, you know, in his work to indicate this walking through the woods, pushing a stick out, watching the sunlight. This was a particular thing he emphasized, which is watching a glade of light, you know, where the light beams down through the darkness and forms these shapes. This was huge, right? And on it goes. So the windy road, the investigation, we are inquiring into the nature. And this is part of, I said, it's not intellectual, it's feeling. As long as we understand that the anima is about feeling it, right? And she opens the door, the shadow turns the key, but the anima opens the door into, you know, our communion with the archetypes. And by that time, you already have to be initiated into introversion and empathy with the self. Otherwise, forget it.
Yeah.
And this is what we're talking about now is very important, because if somebody does go for sort of a Jungian therapy, right, they'll be able to critique the doctor if in 2-3 sessions and we haven't even heard anything we're talking about, right? You know, get out of there, right? Not going to happen. Because this is what it's all about. Now, then we'll finish on the anima. We said was healer, and we wanted to explore that more, right? Well, heal what? Well, first of all, the fragmentation that's happened to the psyche is already a breach. So the anima is always coming in to heal fragmentation. That's one of her bigger projects, right? On a little bit lesser level, this would be more, you know, as you age yourself through the adolescence and through infancy, she's really there to heal inner shame, right? Where the hell does that come from? Well, as I belabored in my work for years now, the shame that you feel inside, it's not the same as guilt, right? Although the anima is definitely there to solve that too. She's the universal nurse. But her real job, her real, you know, house call, the time when she's really needed, right? In an emergency situation, is she is the being within you. And these are just guides and bridges, a way of seeing, which heals the hurt that you've done to yourself, which is what shame is. Guilt is what you've done to others. Shame is what you do to yourself. The Western world isn't even aware that we do. You can prove this. Just go out and ask how many people to define autophobia for you. You'll get my point. But the shame that we feel for committing to the inauthentic life, which is why the word existentialism always comes up, you know, when I'm talking, because it's all about choice, and choice is yourself. All of this becomes existential because you make a fundamental choice to sign on for the will of the parents, to follow the necrophilus will of the crowd and all the rest of it, right? That choice that you make very early on, yeah, okay, your arms are twisted, you know, it is something that's forced upon you, but ultimately you choose to live the inauthentic life. But in choosing that, like Ayn Rand so many times pointed out, you cannot avoid the consequence of doing that. Right? And that's destruction of the self. But it starts in a deep shame that you carry. It's called existential shame. And you carry it with you, and it's never healed. And when the anima is more activated, when you come into deeper communion, this is how you'll know, because you'll be directed to a quiet place, right? You'll desperately want to be in nature, and you'll desperately, for some unknown reason, want to go through, you know, this experience where you're not listening to jarring traffic and the phone is ringing all the time and all that, and you'll go through this healing process, which can go very, very deep. But just to delineate it for people, how can you even heal the shame unless you feel the shame? What we're talking about now is not feeling any shame. It's the intellectual discussion about it, right? Anima is not working at that point. Anima is working when you awaken the feeling that now comes upon the shame, and she will be there to respond, to guide you, right? So it's all about feeling. Now, or the central version, right? And that's a rite of passage. So it will take more than a few days to go through, right? You're going to need, and Jung was aware of this, his patients, would go by the beach, spend a couple of weeks down there, right? Cry, feel, open up, become, get in touch with these oceanic experiences within inside, and come back very, very refreshed and going through a catharsis, right? But the trouble today is that we're now almost incapable of doing this. Our societies are not interested in this, right? So what this means, sadly, is that anima is now moving to become dysfunctional, because our societies don't allow us to do anything we've just spoken about. So healing is suspended. Healing is on all sorts of other levels. You'll have no shortage of advertisements for big pharma, pills to swallow, unless healing with a small h. The real healing we're talking about has actually been suspended, which means that the anima now, and you and I have talked about this in other podcasts, where the anima might return in demonic form. It's the center of work I've done all through last year and for many years before, but it got articulated, in great detail in the Unslaved podcast we've done on women and the unconscious. And what this means is that now our societies will become far, far more toxic. If they become more toxic because the anima is no longer working, then how do people get healing? Big pharma's there. So whenever you don't integrate archetypally, you reach out to some external bastion, so, some necrophilus version, which promises you this stability in order that you lack within. And so all of this now ties into what we see in society. It might look all, discombobulated, but everything we're saying right now is the reason for everything you're seeing in the headlines and all the rest of it, right? The shamanic teachings, the shamanic tribes of the world, and that means all over the world, knew how to send their initiates out into nature, right? So that they could, and then this would be repetitive, all the way through a person's life, right? But we have shrunk away from this healing process, this deep healing, because we don't want to feel enough to feel the shame. So there's several blocks. In other words, as I've said before, we don't want to engage with legitimate suffering, or even concede that such a thing exists. The trouble with that is if you don't acknowledge legitimate suffering, you become the victim of neurotic suffering. And that's what everybody's going through. And they're treating it not by turning within in the center version. They're treating neurotic suffering by institutionalized methods. And that's just going to keep on going and going and going until, it reaches a critical mass, right? The child starts with a child. We have shame because we've loved the unloving. And we keep loving the unloving as if something's going to change. We have shame because we've let others walk all over us when we were young and couldn't do anything about it. We've been humiliated. We've accepted the dictums of the false and the hypocritical of people around us, right? We've had our will crushed, We have shame because of our identification with the objects of our hate. Can't explore that now, but I've done so. Instead of rejecting the authority that's humiliating us, we start to identify with it. This is a syndrome that accounts for the way the world looks the way it is. The identification with the objects of our hate. And then the subsequent shame for doing that. That's all lingering, it's all in the right brain. It's all trapped in the body. So there's so many reasons for this existential shame to exist. Not to say that it can't be healed, but we've become victims of adultism, and we've embodied it. Another one would be, we've systematically see ourselves as imperfect, right? We feel shame for identifying with the object of our hate, but also agreeing that there are these imperfect, we're imperfect. Not, as I said, it goes on to create shadow aspects, right? So there's a lot of different reasons we'll feel this shame. And that's why we will take safety in the crowd. Whatever doctor says is right, big daddy, whatever they say is right, we'll go for, And if the animus expresses itself negatively at this point, it's actually the anima, can you believe it, that is responsible for materialism. It's the flip side of what we said. Remember the nature, the ground, the hard reality of earth? Yeah, but don't you see that in the flip side? That gives the rise to the materialist who says the same thing, in a different kind of way, but he's negating. He's saying, there's just a concrete five senses reality. That's anima possession, as a matter of fact, because she is the prima materia. And she is the world of appearance, sensual appearance and sensual life, you know. Another exaggeration would be the New Age movement. Since she's to do with feeling, and since she has to do with astonishment and wonder, but don't you see how if that's exaggerated, then we have extroversion, right? We have this feeling of these inflated spiritual experiences. You know, have you ever watched the movie Network with, you know, they have this guy Howard Beale who thinks he's been touched by the prana, right? Here's the city dweller guy, right? And he's talking about, you know, spiritual experiences. That's the anima leading you by the nose, you know, and she's coming now in an inflated voice. See, not integration. You're not integrated, so she's just going to either shrink away and never come at all, or it'll come blasting in a way that makes you, you know, sort of one with the universe. We're brotherhood of man. Get my New Age books out, right? You know, like that. Then another negative is because she is the ruler of passivity and nature and motherliness. Don't you see how that can, her negative appearance can be conformity, passivity politically? So when you see, don't transgress, don't be an outsider, right? Let others lead. That's anima possession. So she's active in the crowd. She's active in some of the structures that we have today that are absolutely, you know, Orwellian in the worst sense. Anima is actually behind that. So there's a whole study here, you know, of this in both a positive and negative. You know, we'll get onto the Animus in a minute, but definitely should end on some of the other pathological aspects. So that, again, to recognize the archetypes working in your life, you have to know their positive elements, and you got to know their negative.
Absolutely. So what can you say about the masculine, the Animus? How does that show up for us?
Yeah. Well, according to the strategy or the scheme, and one doesn't have to take it, and Jung didn't say take it as exactly fixed, right? But the Animus would come next, right? You meet the Anima, then it comes the Animus, so to speak. The way I look at that is somewhat the same as I do with the Anima. It came from some kind of worldly experience. What? Right? Well, it's the hero, right? It's the idea that in order to even engage in nature, my God, you have to, you know, suit up, so to speak, right? A lot of people mistake it and say that the anima is the unconscious, right? Where the animus is your conscious mind. I've even read that. Mm-hmm. And that's false, because as we've already established, all archetypes are hidden. And we only encounter them partially. Right? The conscious-unconscious divide means that which is on the side of the unconscious can only be intuited. It's a voice coming across the waves, right? It's largely a symbolic thing. It's not loud at all. So they're wrong to say animus is conscious, anima is unconscious. Throw that out. That's not true, right? It's not the case. So what the anima, if you look at the major arcana, you see a lot of emperors, hierophants, magician, right? You know, even the strength card, right? So strength is the anima, animus. Our animus is the strength that we needed biopsychically, right? Intellectually, mentally, and physically to just engage with the world itself, right? It's like the will to power and the will to meaning. That's the animus. And think about, well, that partition for a moment. Think of the strength needed for the ego to separate itself from the ancestral consciousness, right? For the ego consciousness even to exist, it's a struggle. So for us to go into nature, to be born in nature, was a struggle. For the fetus in the womb, which is a uroboric enclosure, how does that fetus become a child? How does it get born? How does it push its way out of the, you know, the canal, you know, the mother's body? Through will, through a will to power, right? Through a growth process, which just innately, there's no absolutes. Remember that relativism has just told you there's no absolutes. There's an absolute if you're standing on your 2 feet in front of me, right? Which means that you have the will to push through and survive and be born, for goodness sake. Nobody could put that into you. That was already in you, right? So you break out of your uroboric harmony, right? And go into a place of disharmony. Why would anybody want to choose to do that? Because there's an underlying strength and an underlying will to power and will to exist. That's why, and that's an absolute. There's nothing relative about that. If the moment it would be relative, it wouldn't happen. You didn't succumb, in other words, to the darkness. Then the struggle of all the Oedipal stages. That's not a struggle. Sibling rivalry is not a struggle. But it starts with the struggle of the fetus in the womb to become born. It's all humankind's resistance against the natural world, right? Just to encounter it with all of its dangers, threats, obstacles, what have you. Oh, parents, forgot about that one, right? And therefore, a fight is already on. And so the experience of that fight and that struggle and all that goes with it, you see, is animus. It's absolutely incredible when you start getting into it, right? Also, I would say that it is the organizing principle of the psyche. Organization is not the priority of the anima. She has it, but it's in a very loose way, right? The animus has it much more, clipboard wielding, because it had to organize, didn't it, in its relationship to the nature, to the world. There had to be an organizing principle. Don't build your village under a bunch of rocks on the mountain that's going to crash down. Don't build it 10 miles away from the river, right? And all the rest of it would come with that. So there's a systematology involved. And nature comes with its own dynamics, the weather, the seasons, the predators, you see, and all of that, right? And you have to hunt. And in the hunt comes a lot of strategy. So animus is organization, animus is intellect, animus is economy of action, animus is watch time, it's getting dark, we're going to be eaten, right? Hey, let's go in the morning when the sun is shining in the eyes of the predator or the enemy, right? The opposing army. All these strategies, don't build the wall 3 feet high. Why? Well, I think I could step over it, make it 12 foot high. Oh, okay. Right? So all of this stuff is related to the animus in its job of, in its great enterprise of surviving nature. Speaking of this, one of the most extraordinary reasons for animus, why it's so bloodthirsty as well, which is, remember you talked about patriarchy early on? In order for the feminists to take down patriarchy, I give them a real good tip. Find out what it is. Right? Know it before you even try to destroy it. They haven't the faintest idea what it is. One of the reasons that you have patriarchy is because of the threat of the wild animal in our history, in our prehistory. And this is going back into the paleontological, but the Paleolithic, moving into the Neolithic, right up to the Iron Age. Animals were a threat that not 1 in a million people listening to us, unless they're very familiar with this, has ever even imagined. Those toy dinosaurs that the kids love to play with, and the wallpaper of fish and all the rest of it, and teddy bears, that's where we're living. We're not living with real grizzlies who snap your head like a freaking walnut, right? Tigers. Just check out how many deaths there are in India right now of tigers and bears. Right now, today. Hundreds of thousands of people. And it used to be much, much more when there were more of these dangerous animals around. Monkeys will literally club a person to death, especially baboons and so on. We're not getting into the whole thing of it. But insects, birds of prey, alligators, right? Like I said, ticks, spiders, insects, right? So early man, as much as he was enamored by nature, which, as we said, had to be, because otherwise Anima wouldn't have been created, but it was also under deep threat from nature. And the deep threat of nature, mostly in the forms of fanged, dangerous predators, but in other areas as well. We still have those phobias of spiders and mice and all of that, right? We have it because this was once upon a time an extreme threat, an extreme reality for us. And so without getting into all the highways and byways of it, the threat of the predator, which is caused so many daytime and nighttime fears, is a huge part of the need for animus. So when the feminist wants to take down something, beware taking it down, because it has a damn good natural reason to be there. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. It was allowing the mobilization of something. Then on a much more subtle level, and this is sort of turning back towards psychology, but this time not the Freud and Jung, but the Reich. His work encompassed all of theirs, but added ingredients which are supreme, right? The animus is this. In a man and a woman, their body and their biopsyche, right? In other words, where do you think this will is coming from? I've said it in a different context, but it pertains to what we're saying now. The context I was really thinking in previous, iterations of this was the spiritual journey. On the spiritual Siddhartha road, when the outsider does become an outsider, early on we talked about what would that require, what kind of consciousness, what kind of will. We're back to that question now. You won't have the will on the Siddhartha road to get around the first bend. And people listening to me know that, because we've all tried it. Unless you can draw upon a certain kind of bioenergy from deep inside yourself. It's card 14 in the tarot, right? The temperance card with that big basin, that big cauldron. That's, and samak, the letter for that card esoterically means stomach. So it's definitely understood to Qigong people and a lot of other people side that there's a reservoir of biopsychic energy, right? But it's hidden by the armoring. So, and not hidden, but blocked by our armoring, right? So the animus is really one who has to work with the body. He has to be into these arts. He's got to be somebody who's very, very aware of what's known as somatic intelligence, right? Even if you're only halfway there. Because on the spiritual path, it's the animus that's going to be your octane. And it will soon dry up. It's like shoveling coal into the boiler of the train, right? The animus is also a very, very physical, empirical thing. It's your bioenergy. And Jung did talk about it. He absolutely did. On a spiritual level, well, on all the levels, but spiritually, kind of connecting to what I just said, as you go up higher in levels, deeper into spiritual levels, the animus becomes more important to you as an archetype, because like the warrior, like the wanderer, it will be the power to resurrect. So you get it in the scriptures, right? I died. Something knocked me out. These obstacles. I have, what's the word I'm looking for? I become weary. Or like Christ, I go through I meet such resistance that I've died. But the animus gets you up again. It's the man with the no name coming out of the dungeon, right? It's that ability to rise again after adversity, to take the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, right? Animus, not anima, animus resurrects oneself, saying, I can withstand it, and I can rise again after absolute adversity. And probably even go further and win out against, whatever antagonistic forces came at you, right? Yeah, so, and then a few words on the negative of the animus would be, well, we all know what that is. And that's what some of the feminists are, they spotted and they don't like, and that's true. This extreme extroversion, the extreme fanaticism, the extreme patriarchal structures, inflexibility, the instigation of dogma, the lack of this flexibility that's needed. And they're all pretty much correct. The obsessive need for the totemic, Freudian all father, all leader, in the Orwellian sense. There's no question of that. And there's other negatives as well. Just hyper extroversion. If you're possessed by the animus, then you're the dickhead getting up at 4 a.m. in the morning and running along the side of the freeway. You're jogging along the side of the freeway. Believe me, I've seen it, with your headphones in, listening to the news, or animus possession, flashing there. Watch out. Or any kind of more mechanistic relationship with your body, mechanistic, dogmatic, like all these priests, and the priest pedophile types, all just possessed with this animus, dominate, be inflexible, fanaticism, your evangelists, your Billy Grahams, your Joel Osteens. It's not hard to see both anima possession, and it's not hard to see animus, possession. And so, yeah, it can easily go out of balance.
You mentioned resistance to the natural world there, and I'm just wondering what creates that with us, because we are nature. That's exactly what we are. So why would we have that resistance? Do you think cultural and social conditioning, or something else? What do you think of that?
Yeah, well, it is mostly conditioning, right? We live in urban environments, and they're very important. The urban environment has its own dictums that we live by. We, unconsciously, of course, right? But yeah, the real story goes way back into prehistory about ancestral trauma, right? And I've written about that in most of my books. The ancestral trauma that then is constantly stimulated by external tyrants, and that can start with the parents. I'm not just talking about government. A lot of the parental, infliction upon us, right? Adultism also wouldn't work if we didn't have this underlying trauma. Not that parents are consciously aware of this. Remember, we talked about the semiotic level. Before we even get the symbolic and upper systems levels, we have the semiotic, and the semiotic is riven with this trauma, right? Later it becomes symbolic, but it's at the base. So shadow work takes on, don't you see now, a great deal. It's much a deeper phenomenon than we could imagine. Shadow work is to go down into that, you know, dark place and excise. So there's the shadow working with the anima, because she's the healer, and the shadow is the place where the healing needs to take place. So, you know, we have a little bit of a parameter there then on how that would work together. The person who wants to fight the world and become an outsider and go on the Siddhartha road, that's shadow, which is the critic, with animus. They're walking together now. See how it works? Remember, complementarity, right? They always work together. That's why for any, I said this in the very first podcast we had to do on this fiasco, you know, that's happening in the world today. I said that for whatever problem there exists in the world outside you or something inside, also the solution is there as well. So it's just about, this is a time when you awaken, right, these archetypal, you know, and maybe the last time for the human race. I mean, really speaking in general, you know, this may be the last time the human race gets to work with the archetypes. They're giving us grace. They're saying, here's one last ditch effort for us to ground again and let something, you know, let's work with these archetypes. Otherwise the garden will just be full of weeds and it'll be all over. You'll live, but you'll exist, but you won't live, right? You'll be a human, but you won't be a being. You know, because you'll be just programmed robot. Where is the manual? The DMV, the DSMV tells me I have a disorder. Right, that's it. Yeah, you do. It's called conformity, right? But you can abandon the self. You can abandon the inner republic. And the archetypes don't want that. And so even my pessimistic, you know, comments and work on the daemonic archetype, even looking at it at the broadest picture, at least they're still working. At least you have some archetypal activity, even though it's the most, you know, dysfunctional form and the most corroded form. Yeah, well, at least you've still, even amongst the ruins, you've still got some archetypes hanging around. I mean, goodness me.
You know, I put on a few posts recently. I've seen some quotes by Steiner that say something along the lines of that since he was working with children, I don't know when he was around actually, I don't know, maybe about 60 years ago or something, he was saying that there were children being born and coming into his schools who were soulless. They were without soul, and that there have been these people being born since that time that have no souls. And if you go into any shopping mall, any shopping centre, you'll see, you know, faces upon faces of what are essentially, and I don't mean this word in the usual way, but ugly people. Not as in that they're not good looking in the conventional sense, but there's a light missing. There's a spark. There's something missing, and I wonder: is it just the fluoride stare that they have? Is it that they've been program conditioned? In some places, it looks like there's been some kind of experiment done. You know, because these people are just completely they're unhealthy. They're overweight. They are, you know, there's no light. There's nothing. There doesn't seem to be anything there. And then finding these quotes by Steiner that says, you know, there are some people being born that have no soul. This would kind of fit the narrative, wouldn't it? And also the people that are there to do the jobs that other people don't want to do, which is to enforce laws that nobody really believes in. Perhaps these people also would be soulless people, you know, without you know, worrying about, you know, the effects that they really have on society. What do you think of that?
Yeah, he's essentially right. He's speaking in a different language. He's speaking in a sort of a quasi-theological language. I prefer to put it in psychological language, which was why Jung was always very interesting to me, right? He's speaking about the fact that these archetypes are not integrated. How can there be any heroism in those people if the animus is not activated or integrated? How can they be healthy if the animus is not present in their life? Full of vigor, it has a vigor of its own, right? We associate vigor with the animus, but as I said, a lot of these archetypes are all syncretic. They all share traits, and so animus is also your physical body as a structure, right? As an entity. Animus is the energy, right, of the body. If you don't if she's not active in your life, you won't like your own body, right? And I know a lot of people who are listening to me have gone through this, right? Reclaiming their bodies, being okay with themselves, and, you know, and all of that. Animus rules the energy. Anima is the physicality of it all. So what you're seeing is a lack of integration. Remember we spoke about the shame? These people are drenched in shame. Existential psychology, none of them could define it, right? Once you're drenched in shame, it's Steiner's way of saying, you know, that you're soulless. I don't believe anybody comes into this, you know, without a soul. That would be crazy, right? I mean, it's impossible. Too much energy's gone to get you here. But they can come in with evil mom. Now we're talking, right? There's nothing metaphysical about it. It's real physical. You could be in the dragon fight for the 9 years of your life. That'll fucking make you soulless.
59
right?
years even.
Yes. And then remember, look at puberty, right? I mean, by the time you have been sucked dry through the Oedipal and in adolescence, and then you're trying to a man tries to get to know women, and women try in this ugly teenage years of the puberty, good luck, right? You'll turn the page, you give it a go. And I'm not saying it couldn't, as long as the damage with your psyche isn't that much, hey, it might heal. It might go okay. But in my experience, more times than not, it doesn't go okay. The girl would have to know a lot about a father complex. The child would have to know, a male child would have to know, he would have to have confronted, well, it's basically like this. You would have to know how you've been swayed by the will of other people. Mm-hmm. And have to go into that, which certain forums have done, right? But I'm always talking existentially about how you discover it for yourself, rather than what Werner Erhard or Byron Katie or whatever you've got now, right? Anthony Robbins type. It's helpful, right? I'm telling you, in the beginning stages, in many ways, those books, and I'd rather there be there, right, than not there, so to speak. But it's what people lack the discernment, to say, okay, I'm not going to make him into a god or a guru or whatever, but that's a whole other conversation. The main points we're exploring here are, you'd have to have a very good reason for looking back. But with all of this shame, it disables you because it awakens the shame. So you say, if I start looking back psychologically, who's my mom? Who's my dad? What are they all about? Unfortunately, by traveling that road, it will now mean that I'll have to open up shadow aspects that cause so much irritation. But I'm trying to get a date, right? Here, in fact, talking about dates, think of you're in the bar. Think of the classic age-old scenario in which boy wants to go up and talk to the girl. In that process, he's so skittish about it, right? There's animus, right? Because animus is the thing that finally gets you up, and you're sweating. You think everybody's watching you. You're in a state of unbelievable turmoil. Right? We're talking about how the archetypes manifest. There's something in us that is the will to power, right? Where we say, I'm just going to do it. I don't care what she thinks. And then you go up, and vice versa. But usually in our culture, women don't make the first move. It's men. The masculine woman can, and I think that's extremely healthy and good. But in normal, stereotypical life, it's the guy, no matter how dweeby he is, he's going to have to muster this energy to go up and face the humiliation, or go, would you like to come out with me? Can I buy you a drink, or whatever it is, right? And that's the animus at that point. And there's the female version of it as well. And then take that raw will to power. That's nothing more than will to power, right? In the higher level, the animus, and more this would be on the Siddhartha road, more like that level. It's the will to meaning, right? There's a will to power that you're born with, and the will to meaning. And in the will to meaning, you still need bioenergy. It's actually akin to the other kind. It's just now orientated, differently. It's because when you've had the perfect wife and you get all the swimming pools and a really good paying job and all this nonsense, right? You're still looking for meaning, hopefully, right? And some people move vertically on the rites of passage. Other people just stay where they are, right? And so there's leveling off of the anima and the animus. Siddhartha road means being willing to even leave all of that. And then you need the animus with you constantly. And that's when you look at, I think the orphan would cease being an orphan if he didn't have a level of animus to remain as he is, and to take the slings and arrows of being that alienated. An orphan doesn't just mean a child orphan in the normal sense. It's the orphan who has never felt at home anywhere, not even in his own skin. Mm-hmm. How does he avoid becoming neurotic? Yeah. The wanderer who says, I'm leaving, I'm walking out of here. It's not that I don't love you or love this or love that. Something calls me, right? And you climb out of the domestic and the social, and you move forward. Then you got the full-blown warrior, right? Who's always at war with something. And he's going on his journey. And he will cut through illusion because half the path to enlightenment demands that you have that ability. That's all animus. So in our life, if we only had educational system, which we would have had if the people like Steiner and people like him and Krishnamurti, because those men actually embodied all of these things we're talking about in and of themselves, amazingly enough. But we had to get rid of them, right? So we're not integrated. They spoke about nature. They took you out into it to discover the soil, right? Which is Anima, awakening. They took the kids out and they had them, no kid could go to Steiner school unless they had planted a garden, right? Just not possible. And studied up to permaculture and horticultural levels, right up there, right? We don't have that anymore. You know, and maybe, you know, before we should touch on, maybe if you want to go there, you know, some of the pathological aspects of the fallout of all of this, but because that's crucial too, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a few questions as well from some of the people who are on the group. I put it out there that we'd be having this discussion. So one of them is practical tips. It's by Aaron Dunbar. Practical tips on increasing motivation. He feels that there's something kind of keeping him back from some resistance, an indecision towards his move towards self-mastery. Why is that? Why do we have that kind of resistance? Why do we have that resistance? I mean, he's obviously a person, I've kind of read a lot of his quotes before. He's very knowledgeable about tarot and lots of other things, and he wants to kind of grow and develop himself, but there's also some resistance there. What is that resistance?
Because he's not letting go. The journey is not about you wanting anything, desiring something, or even forcefully, you know, attaining anything, although we get into that rut. In this level of attainment we're talking about, it's very, very much allowing yourself to be directed in more of a yin way. So there's too much animus in this situation. It's just speculation. I'm not a psychologist, right? But a pattern I have seen is that we're very Faustian. We drag a lot of our worldly desires and will to power into an area where really should be will to meaning, but we don't know too much about that. What he has to do is sort of fall in love with the lethargy, allow himself to rest, decompress, right? Tune out, go blank. Those fugue moments are more precious than even, you know, the active moments. And we often forget that. It's one of the conditions of the West. This is really something that's endemic of the West. So you muster power and you muster will, and that's all needed, because we said it's axiomatic. You couldn't leave the consensus without it. But there are times when you've left the consensus, you don't need it anymore. You know, the mountain path sometimes has these flat moments where you can just sit down and observe the vista you came from. They are vitally important. You know, somebody could call them gray areas. So the negotiation of the gray area is vital, absolutely vital. And it's usually missed by a lot of people on this road because they're in some sort of soft or hard competition, usually competition with themselves, a need to be always seeing what's around the next corner. Is all healthy, it's all virtuous. All those things are virtues of the animus. But there are these moments where, you know, there is a very important moment to find the still point and look for that leadership and guidance intuitively, right? So that's a step. That's definitely an important step, except it's a bizarre step because you're kind of not stepping, if you get my meaning. You are savoring. You're going circumspect, right? You are not treating this journey like a ski slope, you know, or a one-armed bandit in which there's something going to pop out, right? Too much of that thinking enters back, and it's courtesy of the left brain. There's a contemplative, in centroversion, there's different kinds of dynamics. And so one needs to work on that as well, not doing woo way, right? I've done a lot of work on that in a different podcast.
Okay, we're just looking at some of these other questions. It seems that we've answered a lot of them already. But one of them was about how does the shadow give us messages? And I don't know if you ever saw, but when I first started doing this group last year, I did a very short video on what I called messages from the unconscious and what you called the dark guardians. Do you want to talk about that? Do you remember that term and what it referred to? For me, the messages from the unconscious was like, you know, any kind of sickness or pathology is actually a message trying to show you something within you is not right. But do you want to talk a bit about how you thought about the dark guardians, as you called them?
Yeah, see, that is mostly about the shadow, right? See, for the ego even to exist, a tremendous rift, right? A cleavage took place seismically in the self. And that leaves you reeling. It's almost, you could say that's a kind of a, you know, we talked about an earlier kind of trauma. Jesus, here's one that even, you know, the ego germ, in order to separate itself off from the ancestral, to be lucid, to be conscious, is already an immense struggle. And so that means that you're a divided being, and that any kind of communion with the archetypes is going to be pretty much a struggle. It'll come with, you know, so the dark guardians are like, yeah, I need you, talk to me, but stay back, you're burning me up. The more integrated person is not fussed anymore, and he can sit at the table with the 7 kings or whatever way you want to put it, right? And he has no problem with their counsel. But in the meantime, the presence of an archetype moving close into our unconscious is by no means something that anybody wants, right? It's very, very disturbing. And, you know, it can lead up even into gross pathology, you know, if one doesn't know what they're doing. And courtesy of society, most people do not know what they're doing, right? They'll be led to the thugocracy or, you know, whatever. A lot of people who are, you know, victims of the Animus possession are these self-righteous people. There's nothing wrong with me. I don't even need to do any psychology. You're telling me there's something wrong with me? I'm whole, right? So they don't even have the humility to accept that there's an issue, right? Because the Animus is very much easy to become inflated into this super patriarchal, domineering type that doesn't accept that they've got flaws. You know, the father image is, you know, of a more of a Victorian sort of sense, has elements of that as well. Not that it's missing today. It's repulsive, right? It's the authority figure is what I'm looking for, right? The authority figure does not accept that I'm flawed, that Yahwistic, Jehovistic, you know, Mosaic idea. And so it's incapable. So then when the archetypes make an appearance, it's like friction. It's like a feeling of burning, right? And all sorts of physical armoring. What the hell? Reich's armoring, right? Which is a pathological state that's right in everybody right now, right in their very structure right now. That is, you know, that's your need to suppress archetypal voices within your own being. Mm-hmm. See, so there's already a quotient of bioenergy taken up for defense, the famous defense mechanisms. But boy, God, Wilhelm Reich took that and just went to town with it. Defense mechanism, the word had been bandied about. Reich honed in, well, I'll tell you what a fucking defense mechanism is. It's your structure, it's your own body, it's your own fibers, it's your own inhibitions. And so any kind of shadow work is not even going to be possible without integrating the body in a Reichian, you know, Lauan way, getting rid of what Reich himself called the emotional plague. And the emotional plague is, you know, so much could be said on that. One day we'll even have to go deeper into that. It's incredible, really. Mm-hmm. But crowd consciousness, it'll steer you to the crowd, because the noise and of the crowd blocks out any need of, you know, once the archetypes come to you and start wanting to, you know, you can retract into this aspect. And then to really answer that question, yes, I did go much further and start talking about that subject in a more extreme way, but it's extreme, but it's really consistent with Jung. This is the whole thing, that if none of the archetypes are integrated, they're not going away. Organic things don't go away. Look between the paving stones, grass is still growing. So by that definition, that you cannot destroy the wholesome and you cannot completely banish the archetypal, how would it come back? And so consistent with what Jung was already saying, I believe they do come back, but they come back in a daemonic, right? With a D-A-I or D-A-E, it means the same thing. And it's just to mean, it doesn't mean demonic, like in any kind of satanic way, because that word is loaded with religious garbage. So daemonic is a sort of a halfway point, but these archetypes are still destructive at that point. They're inflamed now. The pathology that you created within your being in order to, you know, preserve ego is going to be a pathology that destroys ego, right? When that dynamic starts to happen, you become deeply neurotic. But the trouble is that if we have too many people like that in our society, which I believe we do, then whatever that society wants in its necrophilous mode is going to become dominant. So Big Brother, you know, all the things we've been seeing in the latter 20th century are born out of this internal psychological dynamic. All the structures that are around us, and these are the Orwellian structures, and that are still to come, unfortunately.
Okay, so we've got one last question here from Stuart Burgess. He says, I don't wonder if you want to talk about this at all. It's the fact that we're born into bondage as a consequence of previous life choices. So he's talking about past lives and how they might play out in our world today. So do you want to talk a bit about that? Quite an interesting subject.
Yes, of course it is. Again, I don't believe in that because I'm not a believer in reincarnation. No, not in the strictest. It doesn't mean I am not open to that it is, right? When I say I'm not into something, it's just because I haven't thought about it, right? It doesn't mean that the theory, right? The Druids had the transmigration of souls, right? But post-Vedic teachings that mostly come out of the East, I've always been suspicious about, right? The way I prefer to see it is that past life is really our way of iterating unbeknownst to ourselves, the semiotic period that we actually, as fetuses and as very young infants experience. And then it just so happens that, see, remember I've spoken before a lot about the search for the surrogate womb, right? That a great deal of what we do in our life is a need to return to the Euroboric pleroma, so to speak, right? This undifferentiated state where the tribulations of the world, right, disappear. We're actually hurtling toward that socially. So all your little hipsters and snowflakes, right, and soy boys and all of their bioenergy, their physiognomy, everything they talk about, I mean, their appearance, the garbage that comes out of their mouth, right? With the help of the state, we're in a state of infantilization. But as Christiva and others beautifully pointed out, and Rank was really in there first, is that we'll fly hurtling past the oral stages. It won't stop there, and we'll go into these pre-Oedipal stages, the semiotic, right? The autistic. There's no bottom to this. I've called it, used other terms like the lunar, right, Stygian realm, in which all forms of mental upper functions are basically voided, or they're just running on automatic. There's a kind of way they get linked, fused to the Mitwelt, to the will of the world, the will of the society. So yeah, the person's still talking and functioning, still moving around, right? You know what I mean? You see the fucking, all that. Nobody's at home. It's like the people you talked about in the mall, because they say, well, I'm this person. I'm called John. They're just, all of their thought is identical. It's in complete entrainment with the bosses, right? That's not a person. That's not a being. And we can fall back into that level. Now, that explains the semiotic level. The semiotic level is a level where you're all people. You're all the world. There's maximum dissociation, maximum diffusion of the personality. They have it in the sand paintings of the Native American Indians and in mandalas where you see all these broken bits of bodies on the outside of the circle, and even sort of demonic faces and stuff. That's the broken self. That's the Osiris, cut up. And we're heading for this dismemberment. Now, one of the other faculties of that semiotic Euroboric sleep is the Euroboric feeling that you're beyond time, right? Time, the lineaments of time are no longer functioning. And also, in a very real way, you become let's just put it strictly, keep in psychology. Content from the unconscious is flooded in. Right? This is pathology. And so in that watery abyss, you're everyone and you're everything. And consciousness that has regressed into that level will start believing in past lives, deja vus, and all of that, right? So it's a pathological state. And that's my, that's my 2 cents. People do not have to believe that, right? And I say continue studying as I am studying the issue of it. But psychology doesn't smile on that. And it thinks that this is a state that is mostly regressive thinking that comes from the mind's either has been flooded, consciousness, the ego consciousness has been flooded or influenced, right, by this content from the unconscious. And there's a lot to be said about that. And one has to be very, very wary. I think that it's coming from the early parts of the, the mind, which have been absorbed in sort of the Euroboric. And from that, you can feel that you've lived in different times and that you have existed even in different times and in different forms, and there's definitely that phenomena. And I'm not saying it isn't past lives, but I tend to look at those kinds of things mostly on a psychological level.
Well, I was actually going to ask you as well about if you knew anything about this idea of twin flames. Have you ever heard of that, twin flames?
Yeah.
People seem to be kind of banging on about it. So there's a difference between soulmate and twin flames. I think one of them is that you, in your past life or before you were born, you already knew this person. You've lived many lives before. But I guess I can kind of guess what you might say about that. If you don't believe about in reincarnation, then that's probably a load of
Well, no, I don't believe in that as it's expressed by Eastern mysticism.
Mm-hmm.
What I believe is, or even some New Age stuff over here, but I do believe in empathy, right? And therefore, my take on that is very Randian, right? In which the sympathy that you're talking about and the empathy that you're speaking between two or more people, right, is born in the concept of shared values. And just like we constantly meeting people who don't share our values, you know, from parent onwards, school onwards, even your siblings or, you know, so-called best friends, you'll have so many things that are not similar, right? But empathy does exist. And where empathy exists is an empirical fact, and we've established that it does. Our whole reaching out to the world implies that it does. Obviously, it is quite possible that that level of empathy can attract, right, somebody with an equal quotient of empathy. Somebody that when you sit down with them or meet them, there's a contact. Remember, and we even said the leaning out towards the world involves eye contact, body language, right, and all the rest of it. And therefore, and also there's other realities there. Resonance, just simple resonance. This has all come out now with this whole thing about whether viruses are natural or unnatural. Or actually, a virus you see can't be spread between people. So that left the question of then how does everybody get sick at the same time? One of the reasons is because it's like women's periods all synchronizing when many women get together. That's it. The outside environment determines it, and another kind of energetic resonance. Mm-hmm. It's not that some fucking virus is being passed one to the other, for the simple reason that not everybody gets sick when everybody around you is sick. Empirical proof, right? Well, where's that going? So I believe that on a similar level there, not anything too supernatural, we got to watch that, right? But I do believe that as a human being, if you have a room of 50 people or 100 people, you're going to be much more empathic with some of the people than others. And by that same rubric, by that same empirical fact, you can, attract somebody, more than one person, because the person you're with who leaves you tomorrow, you thought at the time was, you had a tremendous soul connection to them. But for some fucking reason, unbeknownst to you, they harbored a thing that wasn't that connected and empathic. And as soon as you, violate their particular image of what you should be, they're out. Sometimes out completely. They don't even remain respectful or have a, platonic, say, hey, we're done with this level of our relationship, but I still want to be friends because there's so much I share in common. No. You just hear this taxi pulling up and zazoom, that's it. Well, what the fuck was empathic about that then? Right? So again, we've got breakdowns. But by the same pattern, you can meet multiple people or one person that is really empathic to you and shares the same values. Be glad for that. Past lives, who gives a fuck? The fact that I can even find one person I have a simple empathy with in this world, be fucking glad. Frame it. Right? Because Jesus, look at the loneliness, look at the desperation, look at the inability, look at the total breakdown in gender. Sure, people don't even know if they're male or female. That's where we're at.
So it's all about empathy. I do think this whole thing about twin flame, I think people just like to label things. They like to put a label on something. And also it's kind of, it creates a story. And I think also with the New Age movement, they like the story of, oh yeah, he's my twin flame. But actually, if you read about people, what they think their twin flame is, it's someone that usually gives them a lot of trouble. That's what I usually find reading about people's twin flames.
Is that right?
It is.
Well,
yeah,
remember the Anima, this is Anima related, because remember Anima deals with relationships and empathy. A man sees a very attractive woman, right? At the bar, we described her, what the fuck, on the beach, at work, wherever. He wants to own that because, right, that's attractive. He's empathizing or he's relating to the physical fact of her physical beauty. Yeah. Right? But really, the mug doesn't realize that a far less attractive physically woman, this is actually in the Bible, this is part of rabbinical teachings, really right into the whole essence of God. They say that actually God did this, right? According to some rabbinical stroke Kabbalistic systems, they believe that God fell for Lilith. It's a really wacko story. His real mate, right, who's called the Shekinah, is been temporarily banished from the court. Totally was crazy. in the meantime, the chambermaid seduces God. This is Jehovah, right? And climbs into his bed, right? And he has sex with her because he's so desperate. They're so oversexed, right? It's unbelievable. God as the philanderer, but he's also promiscuous, a promiscuous God. This is I'm not fucking kidding. This is in the Zohar. It's in these rabbinical teachings, right? So he sleeps with what he thinks is his chambermaid. This is God now, mind you, right? The one who's meant to be able to see all truth and know it. He's sleeping with Lilith and doesn't know it. We got some problems here. We got some questions that have arisen, right? But God the blind, God the not all-knowing, has sex with Lilith, who then, basically destroys him. He gets thrown out of power. The temple falls. This is linked to the temple of Jerusalem falling. And the whole, basically that's it. The rule of the demon, because she's actually been a very lowly figure who's risen up through the ranks of the demons in order to get to even be the chambermaid that can seduce God. And they want Spielberg. Right? It's more like Quentin Tarantino. So here you've got this. And then after the fall of God, the whole of the kingdom is destroyed and the earth turns sour, and Lilith and her horde are able now to seduce a succubi. You see, the whole thing. God doesn't stop it either. Now that he's been seduced, as soon as he recovers a bit, he doesn't prevent this. He's all powerful, right? But doesn't prevent the witch, the demon, from going and continuing to seduce all of Adam's, lineage. Weird, right? What it all means, boiled down, is this point. He went to bed with her because he was very, very attractive. Whereas the Shekinah is pure and noble and honest, right? So this is the scenario we find amongst all men, in which the Anima will play with you. All the archetypes are tricksters to a degree, and mythology is what taught us this, and Jung agreed, right? So the Anima as a trickster is the one who seduces the drunken fool, right? And he goes for it because he's intoxicated, right? But the one who's really got the empathy, the real soul mate, so to speak, is the one who is not as attractive, but she's got moral purity. Mm-hmm. So I absolutely believe that there are kindred souls when it comes to the moral, aspect, and that the rest of it is just seduction and intoxication, enthrallment, basically. But I don't rule out by any means, the standard that the moral empathy, can be shared by two people. And believe me, that's as good, that's great to be getting on with right there. That's great to be getting on with.
Oh, that's great. But listen, thank you so much for talking to me, Michael. You've really kind of given us so much to think about. And I'll be working on sort of more Animus and Anima kind of stuff on the group as much as I can. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, it's interesting. You have a group and that they're signed on for this, and I really enjoyed it. Check out the Women in the Unconscious podcasts, and the links underneath that will also lead to a lot of the other stuff we've been talking about, as a point of reference for people. But it's all about catharsis. That's all about changing your way of seeing, and that's happening socially. But regardless of what happens socially, we need to be going through this individually. This is hugely, hugely important. And it really accounts for the Western magical tradition, really. But I've got an article called Jung, Jesus Meets Jung, and they're on the Michael Tsarion website. I know you've posted a lot of my stuff as well. So, that's all been written, for beginners in mind and stuff like that. So, and good luck with the school and your own works on this. It's really thrilling to see that it's happening. Best of luck. I know it's a lot of work, so best of luck with that.
Well, thank you. I mean, I wouldn't have got started with it if it wasn't for the work that you've done. So thank you as well.
Appreciate that, mate.
Okay. Thanks, Michael.
Cheers.